great conversations occasionally. A lot of crazy stuff has happened, but it's funny as we sit here, I'll speak for myself. I don't remember any of the bad times, just the good ones. So, Spirit, believe it or not, started flying in 1983. I think it was called Charter Air at the time. And in 1992, it changed its name to Spirit.
You're looking at a very empty Spirit check-in area at Charlotte Douglas International Airport after Spirit Airlines ceased operations overnight after bailout talks with the White House broke down.
Chanley Painter has the details now. Chanley.
Hey, good morning. So earlier, the company announced it's going out of business, ending its operations immediately, telling passengers not to even go to the airport. That's why it's so empty there. They said this quote, "To our guest, all flights have been canceled and customer service is no longer available." Despite the company's efforts, the recent material increase in oil prices and other pressures on the business have significantly impacted Spirit's financial outlook. With no additional funding available to the company, Spirit had no choice but to begin this wind down. And this morning's announcement could impact hundreds of thousands of travelers and reportedly some 17,000 employees. Through the month of May, for example, some 9,000 flights.
Imagine waking up, grabbing your bags, heading to the airport for a flight you booked months ago, and when you get there, the check-in counter is dark. The chaos is off, the line is going, the employees are going, the airline app is basically useless, and the flight you paid for, planned around, maybe built an entire vacation, business trip, wedding, funeral, or family visit around, is just gone. Not delayed, not rescheduled, gone. That is a nightmare scenario at the center of this Spirit Airlines story. And whether you love Spirit or hated Spirit, whether you joked about the seats, the fees, the carry-on charges, the leg room, all of it, one thing was undeniable. Spirit gave a lot of regular Americans access to cheaper flights. And that matters because not everybody can afford Delta. Not everybody can afford American. Not everybody can afford United. And not everybody can drop $1,000 just to get their family across the country. Spirit was never pretending to be luxury travel. Spirit was the airline you took when you said, look, I just need to get there. I don't need champagne. I don't need a warm towel. I don't need a 5-star meal. I just need a seat on a plane at a price I can actually afford. That was the business model. It was stripped down. It was aggressive. It was cheap. And for millions of people, it worked. But according to the report we're looking at, Spirit Airlines has now ceased operations. Flights have been canceled. Passengers have been told not to even go to the airport, and thousands of workers are facing the fallout. And this is where the story becomes much bigger than one airline. Companies fail. That is part of capitalism. Sometimes businesses take on too much debt. Sometimes management gets it wrong. Sometimes the market changes. Sometimes costs rise. Sometimes the business model stops working. And I'm not one of those people who believes the federal government should run around writing checks every time a company gets in trouble. But what makes this situation different is that Spirit tried to find a private sector solution. Spirit tried to merge with JetBlue. JetBlue wanted the deal. Spirit shareholders approved the deal. The argument from the companies was simple. Together, they could create a stronger competitor in the airline industry already dominated by a handful of major carriers. But the administration's Department of Justice stepped in and blocked that merger, claiming it was protecting consumers from higher prices and less competition. And that was during the Biden administration. Well, look around. Do consumers look protected right now? Do workers look protected? Do travelers holding canceled tickets look protected? Do smaller airports losing service look protected? What about the lead campaign slogan of working class and affordability? Even though working class can be defined in so many different definitions, you have to define that, as we know that typical politicians like to champion that, because working class can be an NBA player playing for the Lakers. Working class can be somebody on Fox News reporting as working class. As far as I'm concerned, as long as you're a worker, you're part of the working class. So you'll have to really define that and really get to the specifics of what working class is. But what I'm talking about is regular people who basically only could afford Spirit. And now it was all about affordability, as We know what politicians on what aisle of the political aisle loves to champion and tout about affordability. Well, what happens if that same party in that same political aisle is the ones that deaded this whole deal from taking place in the private sector during the Biden administration, that champion affordability, when maybe this was the only chance with individuals that are working class individuals that can afford this affordable ticket like Spirit Airlines, but now that's taken away. So now what affordability do they have to be able to fly across the country? What if they planned out holidays and things like this in advance? Now, how are they going to spend holiday with their families and things like this based on this affordable solution that's no longer available? And my whole point is, family, it always sounds compassionate in the press release. But then regular people get stuck with the bill. They say they are protecting the little guy, but the little guy is the one stranded at the airport. They say they are defending competition, but the result is one less competitor. They say they are stopping higher prices, but the result is fewer options and more expensive replacement flights. Now, to be clear, not every merger is good. Nobody serious is saying the government should approve every corporate deal automatically. Antitrust law exists for a reason. If two dominant companies merge and consumers are left with fewer choices, higher prices, and no real competition, then yes, government has a legitimate role. But that is not the same thing as blocking a smaller airline from merging with another smaller airline so they can challenge the giants. Because you want to keep an equal level playing field. That's the whole point of the antitrust law that I just mentioned, right? And that is the part that makes this so frustrating, because JetBlue and Spirit together were not going to become some unstoppable monopoly. They were trying to become big enough to survive and compete. So today we're going to break this down in plain English. We're going to talk about what happened, why the JetBlue Spirit merger mattered, why some politicians celebrated the government blocking it, and what supporters of that decision claimed they were trying to prevent, and why the outcome now looks like the exact opposite of what they promised. Because this is not just about airplanes. This is about whether we believe in free enterprise, limited government, and common sense, or whether we want unelected officials and career politicians deciding which businesses are allowed to live and which ones are forced into a corner until they die. Hit the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and I want you guys to check this out.
Passengers have choices, that they have access to low fares, that they have access to competition.
And socialist Elizabeth Warren said at the time, preventing a merger between JetBlue and Spirit, which would have kept us from being here today, said, "I've warned for months a JetBlue-Spirit merger would have led to fewer flights, higher fares." The irony is that that really kind of socialist viewpoint got us one less airline and fewer jobs.
Well, they should have let them merge. That's clear with hindsight. Secretary Duffy argued against having the federal government bail them out. Commerce Secretary Lutnick wanted to bail them out. I'm glad the president listened to Duffy. We got no the federal government's got no business trying to run an airline. We can't even deliver the mail when the stuff has an address right there on the front. That's free enterprise. You know, I have a lot of friends in small businesses that have borrowed money and tried new ideas, and the government and they didn't work, and the government didn't bail them out. So I'm not a big fan of these bailouts. But I think in hindsight, clearly, President Biden should have allowed them to merge. That probably would have solved most of the problems.
Yeah, having a 10%
between JetBlue and Spirit. And Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg, along with the Biden DOJ, decided that they did not want that merger to take place. And at the time, the Biden and Buttigieg DOJ bragged and said, as they canceled the option for this merger, that this was a victory for U.S. travelers who deserve lower prices and better choices. Now, many at the time said this was a disaster. This merger should have been allowed. And this today would indicate this is not better for travelers. This is not better for pricing. This is not better for competition. Actually, it's worse. We had an airline go down because the markets were trying to allow two airlines to merge, make them stronger, and offer more competition for the American consumer. Also, Elizabeth Warren at the time cheered the blocking of the merger, saying that this was a Biden win for flyers. So again, I think it's important that we always look with a keen eye when airlines want to merge. We care about pricing for consumers. We care about competition. But if the markets are saying there needs to be a merger because there's health issues with one of the airlines or more than one airline, we have to take a look at it and make sure we make the right choices. And in this situation, history has judged the denial of the merger between JetBlue and Spirit through the Biden administration with, I think, a view that it was a massive mistake. So we have been engaged, again, with the airlines.
So now it asks the question, right? Because the beauty of America is you have options as you climbed along the ladder and work hard for what you got. Because at the end of the day, the harder you work is what you get. And you get what you get based on what you earn by how hard you work. And the beauty is you can go from at the time when Spirit was existing, as we know it doesn't exist no more, it's gone. But Spirit Airlines was the affordable ticket. And then as you worked your way up, you're able to enjoy Delta and so forth and continue to join the airline experience that met your financial situation at that point in time as you continue to pour into yourself and allow yourself to grow while also still gaining the experience of flying and enjoying yourself and not being so bunkered down by the constraints of being outraged from the simple fact is that you have limited choices. But now that Spirit Airlines is gone, now is really helping the consumer, as you heard what Sean Duffy just said, because now you got employees out of work and it doesn't help give an affordable option to consumers, meeting them where they are, which was the whole point of in the whole model of Spirit Airlines business. So it tells you the simple fact that the politicians that say and tout about affordability, are they really caring about you as the consumer having affordability to be able to live your life and enjoy yourself? Or they want you to continue to be outraged and continue to be a panicking to the simple fact of that you're constantly begging them for aid and assistance instead of giving you opportunity and privilege to pave your way to earn what you got, meeting you where you are to continue to enjoy life as you pave it for yourself, which is the beauty of America. Because to me, it sounds very contradiction if they want you begging them in the palm of their hand, being outraged and unhappy and not joyful and enjoying life, because the simple fact is you don't have options that meet you at that point in time as you continue to build yourself up. So now you have to go beg the government just to assist you, which then they control you as a way of leverage. And then it would incentivize you to vote a certain way, which then benefits the party over people. But it's not really about the people, because if that's the case, then you will have politicians making decisions like on the behalf of Spirit Airlines on what's best for the American people, aka the consumer, giving them options. See, the way they take the joy away is they take away options and they give you certain constraints where you have to beg them for help. But if you say, look, I can enjoy my life, I know how to navigate. That's the beauty of America. We know how to get over hurdles, obstacles, and become stronger, and it makes us better. I just want the opportunity there, and I'll seize the moment, but I need you to get out of my way, government. Right? So let's get into the actual issue here when it comes to this whole Spirit Airlines situation, because this is Elizabeth Warren back in March 5th, 2024. And this is what she said. I warned for months that a JetBlue Spirit Airlines merger would have led to fewer flights and higher fares. And we're right to stand up for consumers and fight against a runaway airline consolidation. This is a Biden win for flyers. Right? Now, Spirit Airlines has been struggling financially for a while. That part is not some secret conspiracy. Low-cost airlines operate on extremely thin margins. Their entire model depends on keeping base fares low, charging separately for extras, and keeping planes full, managing routes efficiently, and controlling costs. That model can work, but it becomes very fragile when fuel prices rise, with the whole Iran war. And the simple fact is we have oil and we have gas and everything here in America. We do not depend on the Strait of Hormuz. It's the simple fact that the oil companies and the gas company are basically price gouging and using the war as leverage to continue to charge more to Americans than they have to. And plus, gas and oil is based on the global market price, based on the rate that's set, that's sell through all countries selling oil to each other. If we have all the oil here, we drill here. We don't benefit nothing from Iran. We have oil here in America. That's why you have the president actually, since they wanted to shut down the Strait at one point in time, bringing money and revenue back into America because they directed China individuals to come to America to buy our oil. So we have it here. But the simple fact is, if we charge it cheaper here in America, then those countries would just buy up all the oil that we have, and then we won't be able to meet the demand in our own country to supply oil at our gas stations, and then we would be losing money because the global price for the oil all across the other countries, all they would do is buy up ours at a cheaper rate if we lowered it and not go based off the market rate. So if they buy it from us because they need us, because Iran is being petty right now and trying to shut down the strait and don't want to help countries flow their ships like China, who heavily depends on Iran, through the strait. And Trump said, well, come buy our oil, come through the Gulf of America. But if we, like I said, if we make it affordable here and we make it cheaper, all they're going to do is buy it cheap, buy loads of it. They're going to basically double the price and sell it for more to other countries, and then that's going to bring money back into their country. The whole goal is to bring money into our country at the same price they would buy it originally. So that's the global market price, all right? But with the Spirit Airlines, with labor costs rising, fuel prices rising from the price gouging of oil companies and jet fuel companies and gas, debt piles up or demand shifts in the wrong direction. So when you hear that fuel prices and broader financial pressure played a major role, that makes sense because fuel is one of the biggest costs an airline has. But that is exactly why the merger issue matters, because Spirit did not wake up one morning and suddenly realize it had problems. The company had already been looking for a path forward. The JetBlue merger was supposed to be that path. The idea was that a combined JetBlue Spirit airline would have more scale, more routes, more aircraft, more capital, and a better chance of competing against the biggest players in the industry. That does not mean the merger was perfect. That does not mean the consumers will never see any price increases anywhere. But in business, if you have to compare the realistic options, the real choice may not have been independent Spirit versus merged Spirit. The real choice may have been merged Spirit versus no Spirit at all, which we have now. And that is why federal regulators got that's what they got wrong. Federal regulators. And as you see Elizabeth Warren, and that's why she's getting the backlash and the slack for it. They act like Spirit could simply remain independent forever, keep fares low forever, absorb every cost increase forever, and magically survive because Washington preferred that outcome. But markets do not work that way. You cannot wish a struggling company into financial health. You cannot force a company to stay small and vulnerable, then act shocked when a company cannot withstand a major economic hit. That is not protecting competition. That is confusing the theory with reality. And let's talk about the airline market, because this is where the policy argument becomes very weak. The airline industry is already heavily concentrated. The biggest carriers have enormous market power. American, Delta, United, and Southwest dominate the skies. JetBlue and Spirit were not the giants in the room. They were small players trying to build enough scale to challenge the giants. So when officials say they blocked the merger to prevent monopoly power, regular people should ask a simple question: how does blocking a smaller competitor from getting stronger help consumers? How does it help? How does blocking a smaller competitor from getting stronger help consumers compete against these companies that already dominate the market? That is the common sense problem. If four major carriers already control most of the market and two smaller carriers want to combine to become a stronger fifth competitor, that is not automatically anti-competition. In some cases, that may be the only way to create real competition. Think about it like two small grocery stores trying to merge so they can compete with Walmart and Costco. If the government blocks the two small stores from joining forces and then one of them closes, did the government protect competition? No. It helped the giants by removing a challenger. And that is what this Spirit situation appears to show. Officials claim they were protecting consumers from fewer flights and higher fares, but if the result is one less airline, canceled flights, lost routes, and higher replacement prices, then what exactly was protected? The slogan sounded good. The outcome looks terrible. And I'll give you a better one, family. What makes it even more terrible? Because you have someone like Elizabeth Warren, and what a coincidence, because politicians do not have to deal with flying the same way regular people do. A regular American probably could only afford Spirit Airlines, like I mentioned, and just trying to find a way to afford to buy a ticket with all their hard-earned money. Wait in lines, delays, fight for refunds, and have almost no leverage. But when you look at somebody like Elizabeth Warren, may still technically buy a normal commercial ticket, but the difference is who pays, who helps, and how much access they get. For official government work, congressional travel can be paid through official government funds. Senators can be reimbursed for travel expenses for themselves and their staff when it's tied to official duties. Is my whole point. So when you look at that with House members having similar uh, official office budgets, but those funds are supposed to be used only for official work, not personal trips or campaign activity. So the regular person is thinking, can I afford this ticket? The politician is often thinking, is this travel campaign? Is this official travel, campaign travel, or personal travel? Right? So when you look at that, and campaigns can also pay for campaign related travel. And then there's the VIP treatment. Delta typically gives members of Congress special services because lawmakers fly back and forth to Washington and oversee the nation's air travel system. Right? So those services include things like airport escorts, VIP treatment, help with upgrades, rebooking, and a special reservations phone line. So I think that tells you enough right there on what bubble and the differentiation of the average American that they claim they fight for affordability, but then killed the airline. Some politicians celebrated the block, as you can see, the one I mentioned in particular, let alone not just Elizabeth Warren, though. I want to direct your attention also to Chris Murphy here back in January 17th of 2024.
So this week, at the request of the Biden administration, a federal judge blocked a big airline merger between two airlines you've heard of, JetBlue and Spirit. I want to tell you why this is really important for consumers, but also for the country. The Biden administration has made it a priority to try to break up these big monopolies, to try to infuse more competition into our economy. You know this is a problem because you've seen these massive companies become more and more powerful, and that's really bad for workers, it's really bad for consumers. It just sort of, guts the emotional soul of the country when you've only got a couple companies that have this much power.
It's mind-blowing how they tried to give off the perception that Spirit Airlines had this much power when it really didn't. But the ones who do have power, just like I mentioned, for example, with Delta and how politicians benefit, maybe it was to kill the consumer-based airline that actually gave value to customers and Americans who are trying to look for an affordable route that benefits their situation with their hard-earned money, but you killed that and took it away so it benefits and bring more money into the airline that benefits you as a typical politician inside your little bubble, right? So is the disconnect here. So you made the little guy give off the perception it seemed like, oh, it was a big monopoly player that was taking advantage of the airline game, when really it wasn't. It was a little player that actually cared about giving value and gained its popularity due to relating and resonating with the everyday average American that just was trying to afford a ticket and seeing how much the ticket would cost to see if they could even enjoy themselves and have more flexibility to be able to do the joyousful things they want to do, let alone the airline meeting and coming down to the consumer and being for the people as a service and what their money can afford. And now that was taken away, let alone jobs as well. So unfortunate.
Well, that's happened in the airline industry. There's only a handful of really big carriers. Spirit is one of the few budget airlines out there. And wherever Spirit flies, there's a pressure for prices to stay low. The big airlines have to compete with the low-cost carrier. If Spirit and JetBlue merged, then that downward pressure on price would be removed everywhere that Spirit flies. JetBlue.
Well, wouldn't you want them to compete? Because then also it goes to show you, if you let the markets and free enterprise do what it does, the markets will determine based on where the consumers are going, what is the best outcome, and then it will make those big companies that they benefit from, like Delta and the typical politicians that I gave you example with Elizabeth Warren, and how they have the benefit, let alone convene of a big carrier like Delta. Well, it will actually challenge them to actually stay resonated with the typical everyday American, let alone consumer, because the consumer is the one that controls the markets, because where the consumer goes, that's where the value is. And if you give a value that is to the service of those and solving a problem in the name of a solution, then that's how you become wealthy. So if anything, the solution was the affordability route that you killed, because it will actually make the other big four companies that are actually big, because the little guy is actually holding the big companies accountability of challenging them to say, hey, you're charging everyday average Americans high, and we're charging them affordability and still getting them where they got to get. So if everyday Americans start flocking to Spirit Airlines, then it will actually question and let alone show in the profit margins in the face of the big four companies like Delta, United, and so forth, to see, hey, well, this is where our consumers going, so we need to make adjustments. But if you kill the little guy, then the big four companies don't have to make an adjustment, but the people will have to adjust. So now that puts it back into the big companies that they constantly keep touting about instead of actually for the people.
JetBlue admitted that it was planning to increase fares by 25% or more after they merged with Spirit on the routes that Spirit flies. So the Biden administration stepped in and said, no, this merger is bad for consumers and it needs to be blocked. We need to preserve competition to make sure that a handful of big airlines don't get to effectively price set without any competition from smaller airlines. And a federal judge agreed. That's really good news for consumers. It's the first airline merger that's been blocked in 40 years. But it speaks to a broader priority of the Biden administration. The Biden administration, on behalf of all the rest of us, is just fed up with so many big monopoly-like companies having so much power over our lives. Google has that power, Amazon has that power, the big retailers like Walmart have that power. And for the first time in most of our lifetimes, our president, Joe Biden, is telling his regulators and telling the Department of Justice, go after these monopolies, break them up to return power to regular people, to small businesses, and to workers. That's a really great development. And this decision by the federal court to block the merger of Spirit and JetBlue, I think, is a signal that we are finally turning the page on this massive era of corporate consolidation and consolidation of economic power, and finally starting once again to put power back in the hands of consumers.
Well, that was hypocritical, and that was political word salad. That was all bunched up into a lie, because he went from saying that Spirit Airlines was a big, big company, right? Part of the big four, and we have to stop and block the merger of big companies, but then call it a smaller guy at the same time. But then say, oh, it's helping to return power to the regular everyday people, but now they don't even have an affordable solution because you killed the little guy, which was never really a big four company, and never really dominated the airlines as big as a monopoly as you made it to be. But it doesn't hurt them. They can still fly Delta and still have their benefits. So, with all that being said, that is a real problem politically. Because when politicians take a victory lap, they own the consequences of the policy they celebrated. Their argument was that the merger could lead to higher fares and fewer options. Supporters of the bloc said the Spirit was an important ultra low-cost competitor, and that JetBlue might raise fares on some routes after absorbing Spirit. That is the strongest version of that argument, and we understand that, right? But they believe Spirit's independent existence put downward pressure on prices. But again, the argument only works if Spirit can survive independently. If Spirit cannot survive, then blocking a merger does not preserve the low-cost option. It destroys it. My point, exactly, right? And once that low-cost option disappears, consumers don't get cheaper flights. But, I thought it put it back in the hands of the regular people. They get fewer choices, more layovers, more expensive tickets, and less pressure on the big airlines. So when you get actually caught up in the kind of problem itself, you really see what it is for what it is, and actually go through the political word salad and mine it out, and you can see that he was saying a bunch of nonsense, Senator Chris Murphy. They lied to you, unfortunately. So they sold you something that was a lie. So now, when you look at all of that, You still got to rebook. Individuals that's still hoping for a refund that comes. And when you get your money back, that doesn't fix the problem for individuals who already booked with Spirit. That's no longer here. You got to change your schedule. You may lose your direct flight. You may have to take a layover. And you're probably booking at the last minute, which means you're paying more. That is the real world consequence of the real world cost politicians never talk about. They do not experience policy failure the same way regular Americans do. A senator can post about consumer protection from a comfortable office, as you can see, but the family at the airport has to figure out how to get home. The worker has to figure out how to pay rent, and the airport contractor has to figure out whether the hours are still there next week. The small city that depended on low cost service has to figure out what happens when those routes disappear. Now, when you look at all of that, I want to be very clear on this. I do not believe Washington should be in the business of bailing out every company that gets into trouble. The government has no business running an airline. We already know how inefficient government can be when things it directly controls. I do not think bureaucrats managing flight schedules, gate assignments, pricing models, and customer service. That is not the answer. But this is exactly why the block merger matters so much, because the answer was not necessarily a bailout. The answer may have been letting the private sector solve the problem before it became a crisis. Spirit and JetBlue tried to make a deal. The government blocked it. And then when a company collapses, the same government class wants to shrug and say, well, businesses fail. No, you do not get to interfere with the market. Block a rescue path, celebrate your intervention, and then pretend you had nothing to do with the consequences. That is not capitalism. Capitalism is when private actors are allowed to make decisions, take risks, compete, and succeed or fail based on those choices. This is government managed capitalism, where politicians and bureaucrats decide what kind of competition they prefer, even if their preferred vision cannot survive in the real world. That is the core issue here. So when you really get deeper into the policy side, this is where you need to understand what antitrust law is supposed to do and how it can go wrong. Antitrust law exists to prevent companies from using market power to harm consumers, crush competition, or create monopolies. That is a legitimate concern. We are not required to defend every corporation just because it is a corporation. Companies can behave badly. Markets need rules, and fraud should be punished. Contracts should be enforced. Real monopolistic abuse should be addressed. But there is a difference between enforcing fair competition and using government power to impose an ideological vision of the economy. That is where the modern aggressive antitrust movement has become dangerous, because in recent years, some officials have pushed a broader view that treats corporate sides itself as suspicious. Their philosophy often looks at a merger and assumes that bigger means worse. But that is not always true. Sometimes bigger means more efficient. Sometimes bigger means more stable for the company. Sometimes bigger means a smaller competitor finally have enough power to challenge the giants. For decades, American antitrust enforcement leaned heavily on what is called the consumer welfare standard. In plain English, the main question was whether a business action will likely harm consumers, especially through higher prices, lower output, or reduced quality. It was not perfect, but at least it tried to stay grounded in measurable consumer impact where it wouldn't hurt the customers as much. But the newer progressive approach is more expansive. It looks at a size, structure, labor effects, political power, and a broader theory of economic control. And some of those questions can matter, but the danger is that enforcement becomes less about concrete harm and more about ideology. And when policy becomes ideological, regular people become test subjects, test dummies. And that's what appears to have happened here. The government wanted to preserve Spirit as an independent, ultra low cost carrier. On paper, that sounds pro consumer. But if Spirit was too financially weak to survive independently, then the government was preserving something that was already collapsing. That is not wisdom. That is wishful thinking. This is the problem with central planning. The people in Washington often assume they know the ideal number of airlines, the ideal market structure, the ideal fare level, the ideal corporate size, and ideal business model, but they do not have the information that the market has. They do not know what every traveler values. They do not know every route's real economics. They do not know every operational challenge, and they do not even know every debt constraint. Not perfect. The market is not perfect, but prices, profits, losses, demand, and investment all carry information that no bureaucrat can fully replace. That is why the founders were skeptical of concentrated power. Now, and obviously, the Constitution gives the federal government authority over interstate commerce, and airlines are clearly part of interstate commerce. So this is not an argument that the federal government has zero role, but the American system was not built on the idea that a handful of officials in Washington should micromanage private enterprise. The broader constitutional philosophy is limited government, private property, voluntary exchange, freedom of association, and checks on centralized power. That same philosophy is why we defend the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and the 10th Amendment, and limits on the administrative state. The issue is not just gun speech or states' rights in isolation. The issue is whether government is supposed to be the servant of the people or the master of the people. When government gets too much power, it starts making decisions that affect millions of lives, often without direct accountability. And when those decisions fail, the people who suffer are not the senators, the agency heads, or the political consultants. It is the worker, the traveler, the taxpayer, and the small business owner. That is a life lesson here. Good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. A policy can sound compassionate and still hurt people, right? So when you look at this whole thing, and yes, losing Spirit as an independent airline could have meant some fares would rise under JetBlue. That was a concern. But the question is compared to what? Compared to Spirit disappearing completely, a merger may have been the less harmful outcome. If JetBlue raised some fares but kept routes alive, kept workers employed, and kept planes flying, and created a stronger competitor to the Big Four, consumers may have been better off than they are now with chaos, cancellation, and lost capacity. Public policy is not about comparing reality to a fantasy. It's about comparing realistic options. That is where top-down policies often fail. They compare the messy free market to an imaginary perfect government plan. In their imagination, the government blocks the merger, Spirit stays independent, fare stays low, workers stay employed, airports keep their routes, and consumers win forever. But the reality does not care about the political imagination. If the company cannot survive, the fantasy collapse. All right? We've seen this pattern before. Americans were told healthcare would become more affordable through new mandates. For many families, premiums and deductibles became crushing anyway. We were told Pacific Acts will reduce inflation, but families still felt hammered by groceries, rent, energy, and interest rates. They tell people their policies are designed to protect the working class, but the working class people keep paying more for the basics. So at some point, you have to judge policies by results, not by slogans. And that's why the Spirit story resonates beyond air travel. It fits into a larger debate about the role of government in American life. Should government enforce clear rules and protect people from real abuse? Because it wasn't Spirit and JetBlue wasn't a big company that was just abusing to rack up or rise fares, the cost of fares, just because they wanted to. They actually had a legitimate reason to stay an option and let the Americans and consumers decide if that's suitable. And it would determine a lifeline and let it play out in real time if it would uphold the existence of Spirit. But now it just government deaded it. So should government enforce clear rules to protect people from real abuse, or should it try to manage outcomes from the top down? Should politicians let smaller companies grow into real competitors, or should they freeze the market in place because they dislike the consolidation in theory? My answer is simple. Government should be limited, humble, and accountable. It should protect rights, enforce contracts, punish fraud, and stop genuine monopolistic abuse. But it should not treat every business deal like a political crime. It should not block private sector solutions just because activists dislike the word merger. And it definitely should not celebrate a policy as a win for consumers when consumers end up with fewer choices and higher costs. That's the frustrating. The frustrating part is that the people who push these policies rarely admit when they're wrong. When prices go up, they blame greed. When companies fail, they blame capitalism. When workers lose jobs, they blame billionaires. When consumers lose options, they blame the market. But when they blocked the deal, they took the credit. They called it consumer protection in its victory. They cannot take credit for the intervention and then deny responsibility for the outcome. That is accountability, and Washington needs a lot more of it. So when I look at this Spirit Airlines situation, I see more than an airline collapse. I see a warning. I see what happens when government becomes too arrogant and too comfortable interfering in decisions that should be handled by people with actual skin in the game. I see politicians and bureaucrats claiming to protect ordinary Americans while ordinary Americans are the ones stranded, unemployed, overcharged, and ignored. And again, I'm not saying Spirit was perfect. I'm not saying JetBlue was perfect. I'm not saying every merger should be approved. And I'm not saying companies should never fail. What I am saying is that when a struggling company finds a willing buyer, when that buyer could help create a stronger competitor in a market dominated by giants, and when the government blocks the deal in the name of protecting consumers, the government has to answer for what happens next. That is the standard. If you use power, you own consequences. Some wanted to call the block merger a victory. They wanted to tell Americans that it was a win for flyers. But if the result is fewer flights, fewer jobs, fewer rights, and higher prices, then stop calling it a win. Call it what it is, a failure of judgment, a failure of ideology, and a failure of government believing it knows more than the market. This is the economic pattern we see often. They name things the opposite of what they are. They promise affordability and deliver higher costs. All right, family? So I say all that to say, and I want to close here, right? With this being said, when you look at this whole thing, right? Should the government have blocked the JetBlue Spirit merger, or should it have allowed the private sector to work this out before things reach the crisis point? Because to me, this looks like another example of certain economic policies creating the very disaster they claim to prevent. Make sure you like this video, leave a comment, and share it with somebody who needs to hear the common sense side of this story. Hit that subscribe button, turn on your post notifications, and stay locked in, because we're going to keep breaking down issues with facts, perspective, and a voice that is objective. Let the love supersede the hate, family. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.